A sermon for September 20th, 2020. Proper 20 in the year A. Gospels Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Henry Nouwen wrote, "As long as I keep looking at God as a landowner, as a parent who wants to get the most out of me for the least cost, I cannot but be jealous, bitter, and resentful toward my fellow workers or my brothers and sisters. But if I am able to look at the world with the eyes of God's love and discover that God's vision is not that of stereotypical landowner or patriarch, but rather that of an all-giving and forgiving mother who does not measure out love to children according to how well they behave, then I quickly see that my only true response can be deep gratitude." In last Sunday's lectionary lesson, we heard Jesus say we must forgive 70 times 7 or 77. The Greek is vague. The point is, Jesus is saying we can't keep score when we are being forgiving. If we try to keep track of how much we forgive, we lose track. How can we become a forgiving person if we record each and every time we forgive? By its nature, keeping score means we're only counting towards when we can stop forgiving. It's not the way the kingdom of heaven works. And that's what Jesus is saying in today's gospel. Jesus didn't tell a story believing that his listeners would think this is how the world works, but he told the story to show them how the kingdom of heaven works. He begins his story by saying the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for the vineyard. And we can pretty much assume that God is the landowner. We are the workers. In the story, the landowner hires 5 groups of people. He hires the first group first thing in the morning, just as the sun's rising. They're the early risers, the type A, ready to go, willing to give 110%, and he offers them a standard wage, a denarii for the day, and they're happy to get it. And then throughout the day, he hires more workers. Some a little later in the day, some in the middle of the day, some late in the day, and finally, a group right around, 5 o'clock, dinner time. Everyone else might be expected to leave pretty soon. He didn't offer them a specific amount of money in the story Jesus tells. He says, I promise I'll be fair. I'll do what's right. And so they trust him, and they go off to work for him. And at the end of the day, the landowner pays the workers. He doesn't exploit anyone. He pays everyone. And he starts with those who started last, and he pays them. They worked only an hour, and he pays them, and they line up, and he gives each of them a denarius, a full day's pay. He pays those who only worked an hour for a full day. Only an hour. Wow, what a deal. They must have felt great about that. And of course, he pays all the other groups. Some worked 3 hours, some worked 6 hours, some worked 12 hours. You can imagine that they're thinking, well, if this landowner is going to pay those who only worked 1 hour, a whole day's wage, what am I going to get? Boy, they're all excited. But he hands each of them just a full day's pay. And now you can imagine why they're a little disturbed by this. Doesn't seem fair. Someone else worked only an hour, and I worked the entire day, and we both got paid the same. How is that right? But you can see that we're on a different scale here, and we're working with a very different set of priorities. Remember that when he hired those the first of the day, those first ones who came to work and worked faithfully all day, he told them exactly how much he was going to pay them. And they got exactly what he said. He didn't change anything. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. I can imagine feeling that they might feel quite upset about it. Sure. They're not complaining about the pay that they got. They're complaining that the people who only worked an hour got the same pay. By that standard, if we're going by, a rate of pay, if an hour is worth a denarius, they should be getting 9 or 10 of them. But that's not the way things work, and that is not exactly what they were promised. The landowner says, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree to this wage? This is what I said. If I choose to give to those, here my cats are joining me, if I choose to give to those who didn't work very long, the same as I give to you, that's my business, not yours. I paid you what's fair, and I paid you what we agreed on. So go ahead and go on your way. They're envious and they're jealous. It doesn't seem fair. And yet, let's think about this. We're so accustomed to an economic system like we have in the United States, a capitalist system where the idea is that if you work super hard, at the end of the day, you're going to have more than anyone else. And we know that isn't true. If the standard for getting ahead and making a great deal of money were simply working hard, single parents who work 2 or 3 jobs would be the wealthiest people in our country. That isn't the way it works. We've had this idea that hard work is the only factor in wealth, and that simply isn't true. We know from looking at compounded wealth that those who were denied wealth for a long time or access to home ownership or land ownership for a long time never get a chance to build up equity, never get a chance to get ahead, that don't have generational wealth behind them. And there are plenty of people like me who can say, well, I don't have generational wealth behind me. Nobody in my family was rich. But there is a tradition in my family of land owning. There is a tradition in my family of home owning. There is built up behind me a legacy of getting ahead. In this country, Black people were denied all of the opportunities to have that generational wealth. They were denied it in many different ways. For generations, their labor was exploited for no pay at all. As slaves, they might have been fed and housed, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, but their labor, the fruit of what they worked for, was never theirs, never belonged to them. Even when slavery was no longer a legal institution, companies wouldn't lend money for home ownership. The legacy of redlining persists to this day. There are districts in this country where you can clearly see from the statistical averages, it's not that Black people don't want to live in a particular neighborhood, it's that they're denied access to it. It's not how hard you work that gets you ahead in a capitalist system. It's simply not. And any of us who perhaps work very, very hard and have had a really hard time getting ahead might be like these workers saying, that just doesn't seem fair. Jesus is talking about a slightly different scale here, though. And let's think of it this way. What Jesus is talking about is that every person who was willing to work was taken care of. If you looked at a system in the United States where every person who was willing to do some form of work was taken care of, had adequate housing, had adequate food, access to health care, and the means to pay for it, education for their children. If all of those things were present, and anyone who was willing and able to work any amount of time, whatever they could, we'd be a very, very, very different society. And maybe closer to the way the kingdom of heaven looks. I say those who are willing and able to work. I have almost never, I cannot think of a single person I've ever met, known of, friend of a friend, and I've met a lot of people who actually don't want to do any kind of work. Almost everyone wants to do something that's fulfilling, that brings them joy and pleasure. Some people aren't able to, and we know that. Some people are really not able to work, and there ought to be safeguards and things in place to keep those people at the same place as those who are willing to work. If someone's unable to work, what says they're less worthy of living a complete life and not having to worry about how to feed or clothe or house themselves? This idea that wealth is the standard by which we measure worth in this country is the problem with the capitalist system. Those who have are seen as somehow more worthy than those who have not. In this country, it's seen as shameful for those who can't work. People with disabilities will tell you over and over again how they are shamed, how they are spoken to and looked on as somehow people who are getting a free ride, getting what they don't deserve. It's not fair. Why should that person who hasn't done anything but an hour of work have the same benefits as me? And yet that is what Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is like. And think of it this way. Those who were hired early in the morning had the easy assurance all day long of knowing what they were going to get. They set out into their day and they knew they were going to be paid a full day's wage. They started off their morning and they knew they had work for that day. They were going to bring home money for that day. There's a sense of ease and comfort in knowing that you have work, that you can do the work, that you are able, and that at the end of the day, you'll be paid fairly. That's a compensation that the other people hired later did not get. Now think of those people who waited all day, the ones who were hired last. Presumably, as the landowner is hiring, he's hiring the able-bodied. So my guess is that those who were left for that last hour of work were those who had a harder time. Maybe they were the older people. Maybe they were those who had a weak back or a missing limb. Maybe they were those who, for whatever reason, were less able. They had no assurance of anything. Didn't know if they were going to get hired at all. In fact, chances were not looking good. They were in that last hour standing in the marketplace just waiting for someone to come and choose them so that they could have a wage that day. And then, lo and behold, the landowner does. And they have work. And I'm sure that those who agreed to that didn't go into the field thinking, well, I'm only going to work an hour and I'm going to get paid a full day. They didn't think that at all, of course. They thought, I'm going to get an hour's worth of pay, but it's better than nothing. I think what Jesus is trying to say in this story about the kingdom of heaven is that God does not play by the rules of capitalism. That God is a God who wants to give to everyone. That even those who are unable to do more than an hour of work were worthy of a full day's pay. Odd concept. It's not the way we do things here. But then again, the kingdom of heaven is always different than what we think we are going to do on earth. One of the things that Jesus asks us to do in our mission as Christians is to bring the world closer to what the kingdom of heaven is like. Imagine a world where you would be paid fairly, regardless of who you are, regardless of whether you were able-bodied and able to get up crack of dawn and work all day. Regardless of whether you had a harder time and couldn't get down there until noon, finally got hired and were grateful for a half day. Regardless of whether you were one who finally dragged yourself out and even could only work one day, but still provided for, 1 hour, but still provided for. Imagine that kind of world where everyone has enough food, enough housing, enough clothing, enough health care. Hiccups. Imagine that world, because that is closer to the kingdom of heaven, far closer than we are now. What's really the problem with this parable? Why do the workers who worked all day grumble and complain? Why do we grumble and complain when we compare ourselves to others? Why do we keep score, even in the church? You ever paid attention to how a coworker is doing? Oh, they're getting more than me. Oh, that person is getting favored. Forgiveness, being part of our makeup, means we can't be keeping score on these things. And I think a great deal of contentment comes into our lives when we realize that we have enough. What's sad to me is that in our country, quite often, we don't. People don't. And the misconceptions about people who don't have enough are rampant and used to shame. They're used to shame people because we have equated wealth and, quite frankly, excess wealth. We've come to equate that with worth. And those who do not have the excesses of wealth are simply deemed not worthy. Not worthy of our attention, not worthy of our time. The kingdom of heaven and God. The landlord, the kingdom of heaven, God, looks at us and sees our needs and meets those needs. That is how the kingdom of heaven works. That our needs are met, that we have enough, that we can eat without worry, that we are housed each day with an adequate shelter, and that we don't have to worry about losing it. That every day we have warm, decent clothing to put on, and we don't have to worry about where we can find that. That every day we could, if we are unhealthy, get care for our disease or illness, our unhealth, and that no one will lose their clothing and their housing and their food in order to be cured of a disease. That is closer to the kingdom of heaven. It's why I cannot really understand those who claim to be Christian and yet use the measure of worth that is brought about on earth by human beings, the measure of worth that is wealth. That is not how God measures us, and that is not our worth. Jesus said the last will be first and the first last, not to tell us how things are in the world, but how they work in the kingdom. We're asked not to keep score, not to see others as deserving or undeserving, but to be generous and to understand that in the kingdom of heaven, there is enough. And there is no need to be greedy, and there is no need to grumble, and there is no need to compare when we have enough. My prayer is that someday, through our combined efforts, the world will look like the kingdom of heaven, where all can be fed and housed and clothed, have work they love and enjoy, and have enough. In the name of God, who created, redeems, and sustains us. Amen.